page. It says we're waiting around for an ice age. It says our comforts, they come with the price. I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
And we are VIMTV, Velocities in Music, the best kept secret in music reviews. A couple of years ago, Tom, we reviewed a band at the request of one of our followers. They wanted us to review a dynamic, audio, orally intensive album from an indie band named Typhoon.
Yeah.
That album came out in 2010. It was 2011 when we reviewed it. That album was called Hunger and Thirst. Now, 2 years later, we hear that Typhoon is coming out with a new record called White Lighter. So, of course, we have to pick this up. Typhoon is a band, to me, that sounds a lot like a mixture of other indie artists like Cloud Cold, maybe Sufjan Stevens,
Definitely.
Arcade Fire. They do a lot of really progressive indie rock sounds. There's 14 band members here. They do anything from strings, there's trumpet, trombone, a lot of guitar, a lot of bass.
Auxiliary percussion.
Auxiliary percussion. It's a very loud, dynamic, and just a spanning instrumental palette that really makes this a very unique sound. Tom, what was the sound specifically to White Lighter, and how did it affect you?
Well, coming off of Hunger and Thirst from, a couple of years back, that album was one that really impressed us.
Yeah.
And so the first thing I noticed about this, of course, naturally, is going to be, how is it different? How is it the same?
Right.
And I feel like with Hunger and Thirst, which wasn't their first album technically, but I feel like it was their first kind of big break into the scene, if you want to call it a big break, a bigger break than what they
Breaking into the indie music scene.
Yeah, however big of an impact that is. But I feel what they did with Hunger and Thirst was establish themselves as a band that was willing to experiment, willing to be creative, and really make just big emotional indie rock movements. But Hunger and Thirst as an album still felt pretty accessible, still felt, I don't want to say safe, but you could tell that they had a lot more potential than what they were really tapping into.
I completely agree.
And man, on White Lighter, it's like that potential got an adrenaline boost and just got jacked through the frickin' ceiling.
They drink a lot of Red Bull.
Yeah, I feel it. And during the writing process too, because this takes all of those little things that I heard on Hunger and Thirst and just pushes them to 11. I mean, you have the vocalist is so much more emotive.
He's so
much more
passionate.
intense. Yeah.
He's so passionate throughout this album. I hear the same thing in the guitars, though. In the bass.
They're all there to
the
match.
instrumentation. And when you have 14 band members, I expect a big sound. But what impresses me more than the bigness of Typhoon's sound is the fact that they can bring it down so low.
Yeah.
They really run the gamut when it comes to making just absolute fortissimo highs and absolute pianissimo lows.
Yeah.
It is polar opposite on the dynamic spectrum.
With every band member that you add to a band, it takes that much more tact
And control.
Yes, to actually be able to pull something off that is well controlled and well put together, because you have everyone in the band just naturally being like, I want to be a part of it, I want to do something.
Yeah.
They have to know their place.
Give me a role, Daddy. Give me a role.
No kidding. So I think that is one thing that's very commendable about this album, is that they're able to work together into just a tight piece of machinery and pump out these songs. Even more so than the performance aspect in the songwriting,
Right.
because these songs they're so sparse. They don't stay in the same place for very long at all before they're moving on to a different idea.
There is no formula.
Yeah, and the album flows so well from track to track. There's a little bit of separation, but everything's planned out so well that I just think, how do you get together and write something like
They
this?
do a great job of knowing which tracks are more dynamically and emotionally intense and separating those from the other tracks that are similar. And that makes for a more fluid listening experience. Now, what I love about this record is that, first of all, it starts off with a prelude. Whenever I see an album start off with a prelude, I get all jittery and tingly, because I know that I'm in for an album listening experience, at least a good indication of one. Then the album kicks off with track 2, Artificial Light, which I think is the most technically and emotionally intense song on this entire record. It goes all over the place as far as songwriting is concerned. It's loud, it's soft, it's passionate, yet it's restrained at the same time. It's just a great track. It's a roller coaster of a track that kind of sets the stage for it's the thesis statement for the album, and just sets the listener up, sets their expectations perfectly for what they're going to experience throughout the rest of the record. Then the track moves into Young Fathers, which is acoustically driven, lots of dynamics. It's just a strong track. the album continues on. Eventually you get to emotional high points like 100 years. But then, Tom, I'm going to just hand this off to you right now. Hunger and Thirst was one of my favorite tracks.
They pulled a Houses the Holy.
They totally
They took the name of their previous album and made it into a song on their next album.
Which is cool because it ties the album
It really
together.
does. And I think that there's enough similarities in the sound and what they were trying to accomplish. So I think that's cool because they're not just approaching, you can take the songs on an album and try to make it to an album. But what's even more impressive is when you have an artist or band that takes all their albums and puts them into a discography.
Yep.
I know you mentioned before saying that the White Stripes is a band that is very much like that. And I love that. I think that's true. Obviously, Coheed and Cambria is doing that, a little bit more on the pop side of things. But Typhoon is doing that as well, and they're not nearly as heard of.
Yeah.
And I think that they should be. Another thing I love about this album that I was kind of hinting at earlier is that every single sound on here comes off as deliberate. I love listening to something that, and it's not just because it's so complex. It had to be deliberate in order for something this complex to even be pulled off and executed. But you can tell just when it comes to the writing, the crafting of the songs. I mean, you mentioned Young Fathers. That track right from the get-go has these really odd rhythms and odd meters and chord structures even to go along with them. That right at that moment, the first time I listened to this, it was actually a little tough for me because it's hardly accessible.
Yeah.
You really have to think to figure it out, and that makes future listens more rewarding. But
totally agree.
But in that moment, it's a little off-putting, and I was like, okay, they're experimenting to the max. Really, all that means is that it is worth the more listens to figure it out. And then when you do, it's such a good experience. And from there, I actually don't think it ever gets quite as crazy as those couple of tracks to begin with.
You get some emotional high points. Like 100 Years rocks the hell out. Hunger and Thirst, there's some real intensity in the vocals.
And great horns.
Yeah, absolutely.
That song had great horn highlights. Now, we've been sitting and praising this album. Obviously, we both really like it. I think there's a lot of commendable stuff going on here. If I had to have one complaint, I would actually say that at some times, maybe just the pop side of me was wishing that they would establish and develop one idea just a little bit longer. It's hard to latch onto an album where they're moving so quickly from idea to idea that you don't even know. It makes it hard to be memorable first off. Now, I think this album is memorable just because of the sheer quality of musicianship and what it accomplishes. But it takes more listens for that reason. Like I said, totally worth it. But it makes it still inevitably a little tough in the end because when you have something so good, you want more of it.
Yeah.
And when every little section of this is good, it sounds like it's actually a quality, a positive quality of the album that ends up kind of affecting.
Yeah, and if you think about some of our favorite albums of all time, they all I'm thinking of 9 Inch Nails, A Downward Spiral, Elbows, Seldom Seen Kid. They all experiment, right? All of these favorite albums of ours, Tom, experiment, but they always seem to have at least one or two tracks that are a little bit simplified, that drive this emotional point home and sell the album.
And they act as an anchor.
Yeah,
they hold everything down around it.
They're the accessible entry point, and they also give context around everything that you've heard. This album is lacking that. However, I think that this band makes up for it on White Lighter for just their sheer originality. While they're citing influences here, there is nothing that comes to mind that sounds like this. The closest thing is the Arcade Fire, and I haven't heard the Arcade Fire sound this experimental ever. This is far, bar none, one of my most experimental original albums I've heard in a long time, and for that I give these guys a ton of credit. The other thing I would want to compliment them on is this ability to have this dichotomy between just blowing me away from a mental standpoint, just analyzing the crazy songwriting in the song structure shifts, all the instruments that I have to hear and pick apart. Every sound is deliberate, as Tom says. That is an intellectual orgasm. And at the same time, though, I'm getting blown away emotionally. These vocals are intense. This guy is belting it out. He's pouring his heart into every lyric that you hear, and then you have a lot of choral backing vocals at times, putting it over the top. Every single instrument is played with such passion, such power, that it's impossible not to just fall in love with this. Now, I will say, it took me several listens, 4 listens before I started to really interpret this album in a way that I can go, oh man, they're doing something crazy special here that I haven't heard in a long time. And it got me really excited because those albums, the ones that take 4, 5, 6 listens to really get into, those are the special albums that I keep coming back to year after year after year, like Lost in the Trees, A Church Our Fifth.
Helplessness Blues,
Seldom Seen Kid. These are the albums I keep coming back to. There's these albums that shake the core of what I know what music is. Typhoon's White Lighter does that. It could be stronger. However, I feel like what they accomplish is worth noting so much. This is just a damn good album. I'm going 85 on it.
I'm going to 83.
So, mid-80s. That's a great album. You guys need to go out, pick up Typhoon's White Lighter. Typhoon isn't a very well-known band, although they are getting a little bit more popular. If you haven't heard White Lighter, we really want to hear what your thoughts about it are. And leave us a comment, what you like, what you didn't like. We'd love to have a discussion with you guys. Leave us a comment, please, at www.velocitiesandmusic.com or youtube.com/velocitiesandmusic. As always, follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and tell us what albums from 2013 you've been into lately and would like to see Tom and I review. I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
And we are VIMTV, moving music critique forward.
In the beginning, everyone bowed their heads to the Lord. They would dance and eat their friends alive. We were not happy then. These were